All right, hello everyone. So we're learning about the Industrial Revolution, and in our lessons last week, we found out about the development of the factory system during the Industrial Revolution. And we found out that more and more people were moving from the countryside to live in the city during the Industrial Revolution, and that the goods and products were no longer being made really in people's homes in the domestic system, but they were being made in big factories with what was called the factory system. Now, these factories needed power, and we needed more power during this time. So that led to the growth of more factories, but also more coal mines as well. So we're going to focus today about children having to work during the Industrial Revolution. Now, children had always had to work during this time period. So it was very common in medieval times and in the Tudor times that children would go out and work with their families on the farms and stuff like that and help bring in the crops and things like that. And they would work with the domestic system as well. But now that we have this industrialization, these children ended up working in places like factories and mines, and often these were very, very dangerous places for these children to be working. So this picture shows you a picture from a novel written by Frances Trollope in 1840 called The Life and Adventures of Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy. And she based her book on a real factory apprentice called Robert Blinky. Now, if you can see what's happening in this picture, one of the things you can see here is there is a small child who is peering out of this machine. And he is doing a job which is known as a scavenger. And these children would go under these machines and they would pick out loose bits of cotton that would perhaps causing problems with the industrial machinery at the time. A very, very dangerous job, and a job that if you got it wrong, you could easily injure yourself. These wheels would go backwards and forwards, so they could run over your feet, for example. They could crush an arm or a leg, or there are examples of children actually, very, very sadly, being killed doing some of these industrial jobs. So we're going to find out more about child labour during the Industrial Revolution today. And then in a future lesson this week, you're going to learn about the worst jobs in history. So this is child labour during the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to find out what kind of jobs children did, and then we're going to look at some sources, and you're going to have a go at doing some questions about sources towards the end of the lesson to think about how we find out the truth about children's working conditions during this time. So the Industrial Revolution created lots and lots of new jobs, and we're going to find out about a whole range of different jobs in our lesson as well this week. So one of the first jobs that was created for children, if you like, was a child chimney sweep. Now, during this time, people needed their houses to be heated and had chimneys, for example. But chimneys get very, very dirty and they need sweeping. And children were ideal for this job because they were small. And many of these chimneys were relatively small in these pokey houses that people had. And it would be very, very difficult for an adult to actually do the chimney sweeping. So small children, normally boys aged between the age of 5 and 10, were sent to sweep chimneys, both in people's homes but also in the industrial factories as well. Very, very narrow, and sometimes the children would get stuck, they would injure themselves, they would actually fall down the chimney, they would injure themselves, they would twist their spine, they could even get burnt whilst sweeping out these chimneys as well. So not a very nice job, very, very bad for your lungs as well, you know, all that soot and all that dirt getting into your lungs as well. So that was a job that was done by children during the Industrial Revolution. The next one, as I was talking about before, is this scavenger. So this tended to be children between the ages of 6 and 10. They had to crawl under the industrial machines, and you couldn't stop these industrial machines because if you did stop them, then they would all have to stop, and that would cost the factory owner money. So you couldn't, you know, like nowadays, if you're going to clean an industrial machine, you would stop it first and make sure it was all safe and all that kind of stuff. But this cleaning and removing the loose bits of cotton was done while the machine was moving backwards and forwards. The scavenger would only be able to do this until they're about the age of 10, possibly even younger, because you would then just be too big to actually crawl under the machines. You have to work very, very long hours. So although this job might not be too difficult if you were just doing it for a few minutes, you would have to do it for many, many hours of the day. You would have a boss as well. You can see this person in the background with a top hat would be called an overseer, and they would beat people up if they weren't working hard enough. So that was a scavenger in a factory. And this is Robert Blinky recalling his time working in a factory during the Industrial Revolution. And this is what he said. I had to pick up loose cotton from the floor. I was terrified by the noise of the machines. I felt sick and my back always ached. I was not allowed to sit down and had to work for 14 hours a day. I was always hungry and thirsty. So it's not just the danger of these industrial jobs, which you can infer about life in a factory, but it's the boredom, it's the noise of the machines. You know that small children sometimes don't like loud noises. The noise of the machines will be deafening, so that would affect your hearing. Always crawling under the machine, your back is going to be aching. You've got all the loose bits of cotton in the air, so that's going to get in your lungs. It's going to make you feel sick, for example. So really, really horrible conditions. And if we look at this source, by the sort of middle of the 19th century, Parliament and the MPs began to look at children working in factories, and this was what was called the Select Committee of Factory Children's Labour in the 1830s. And you can see here, this child began working in the mills at 8 years old, worked from 5:30 in the morning till 8 at night, only allowed to get the toilet 3 times a day. So often, they wouldn't make it to the toilet because they wouldn't have enough toilet breaks. They were often beaten at work, breathing in all the dust. So this child talks about how he coughs all the time, spits blood because his lungs have been damaged by working in this factory. So some really, really horrible things working in the factory. So that was some of the jobs that were done in the industrial factories during that time, and they were sometimes known as a scavenger. Or sometimes known, one of the machines was called a mule, so they're often known as the mule scavenger. The other job that was created in industrial factories was what was called a trapper in a mine. Now, the mines were very, very big during the Industrial Revolution, and in the mine you have to dig a big hole in the ground. You would take the workers down to the level where coal would be, and then you would dig tunnels to get to what was called the coal face. And then the miners themselves would then dig out the coal, and then in carts they would then bring that to the bottom of the mine shaft, and then the coal would then be taken up to the top. So that's what happened in the mines during the Industrial Revolution. But because when you were digging the mines, that could often lead to poisonous gases being released, and sometimes, if these combined, it could cause things like explosions. There would be these what were called ventilation doors down the coal mines to stop all the different gases mixing together and potentially causing an explosion, or also potentially the release of toxic gases, which could cause people to become ill, even pass out, or even be killed. That's one of the reasons why they used to take canaries down the mines with them, because if the canary suddenly dropped dead, that would be a sign that the air had become toxic and the miners needed to get out of there. So the job of a trapper would be a small child, and their job basically would be to open and close these ventilation doors when needed, when the miners were bringing these carts full of coal along the actual tunnels in the mines. So basically what the child would do is they would sit in the dark and they would make sure the door was closed, and when they needed to, they would then open this door. So it's a pretty boring job. It's not quite as dangerous as, say, the mule scavenger, but they were sitting down there in the complete darkness quite often for up to 14 hours a day, nowhere, for example, to go to the toilet, very, very lonely. And these, you think about small children now often get scared of the dark. These children are, down the mines in the pit, between the ages of 6 and 10, doing these really, really, pretty challenging jobs. So that's the job of a trapper in a mine. So here's a couple of sources about trappers during the Industrial Revolution. This is from Sarah Gooder. She was aged 8 and she worked as a trapper in a mine. This is what she said. I am a trapper in a mine. I have to trap without a light, and I'm scared. I start at 4 and sometimes 3:30 in the morning, and I finish at 5:30 at night. I never go to sleep. Sometimes I sing when I have a light, but not in the dark. I dare not sing then. I don't like being in the pit. So just have a think now. What can you work out? Infer means to work out from the source about what Sarah Gooder thinks about the life as a trapper. Now then, let's have a look at another source. This is from the Marquis of Londonderry. Now, he was a mine owner. He owned several mines in the northeast of England, around places like Durham, for example. And this is what he says about the job of a trapper. He says, the trapper is generally cheerful and contented, and to be found occupied with some childish amusement, such as cutting sticks, making models, and drawing figures with chalk on his door. So what can you infer from the source about the life of a trapper? So have a think about that. You can jot down some ideas if you want to. So what I want you to do, the task I want you to do is read those two sources again, and then I want you to think about these two questions and then answer them, please. So how are the views of Sarah Gooder and the Marquess of Londonderry different about the life of a trapper? And why do you think the sources are different? And which one do you think is the most reliable? So I want you to have a go at answering those two questions about those two historical sources. So in this lesson, we've learned that children had to work in various jobs during the Industrial Revolution. We've learned about chimney sweeps, we've learned about scavengers, and we've learned about trappers. We know that two of the most dangerous jobs were working in the factories and working in the mines. Sadly, we know that children were injured or even killed and suffered health problems. Eventually, they did pass laws to improve working conditions for children. And actually, in 1870, they passed Forster's Education Act, which guaranteed that children would be able to go to school up until the age of 11. So during this time period, attitudes towards children working slowly began to change, and there was more of an emphasis on that children needed an education rather than being working in these industrial jobs. And obviously now we know in the 21st century there are strict laws governing about how much children can work and what kind of jobs they can do. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed that lesson about children working during the Industrial Revolution. And as I said, next lesson we're going to look at a range of different jobs in the Industrial Revolution. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.